My name is Emily, and in 2012, I was 17, old enough to understand family chaos, but still young enough to get caught in the middle of it. This story happened on New Year's Eve. It was the kind of night that begins normally, even peacefully, with soft music playing on the radio and winter wind brushing gently against the windows. Yet beneath that calm surface, our home carried the quiet tension of a family trying very hard to create a perfect evening. My father had declared this would be the most organized, peaceful, and memorable New Year's Eve our family ever had. And that declaration alone guaranteed the opposite. In 2012, my dad still believed that control could defeat chaos and that planning could prevent surprises. Life had corrected him before, but he was optimistic. My mother was quietly supportive, though I could see the concern in her eyes. She had lived through enough of our celebrations to know better than to trust promises of calm. My younger brother Alex, who was 11 then, had a spark in his eyes that evening, a spark that suggested he had his own secret plans for the night. And then there was Grandma. 70 years old, but her soul was as energetic as a child's. She carried the kind of unpredictable spirit that made every holiday unforgettable. The evening began with my father preparing a special dinner. It was his mission, his masterpiece, the centerpiece of his perfect New Year's Eve. He had bought the largest chicken he could find, proudly holding it as though it were a trophy he'd earned after a long victory. The chicken was intimidating, far bigger than any of us expected. My father seemed unaware of the battle that awaited him. Meanwhile, my mother arranged the living room, placing candles and warm lights, trying to make the house feel like a peaceful retreat. Outside, snow floated gently through the air, falling slowly like tiny shards of crystal. It looked like the night was promising serenity. But serenity is a fragile visitor in our home. It doesn't stay long. By late afternoon, I began noticing small signs that the night wouldn't go as planned, like the faint smell of something burning from the kitchen, and the unfamiliar sound of my father whispering frustrations at the chicken as though it could hear him and was being intentionally difficult. Being the eldest daughter meant stepping in before the situation escalated. So I walked into the kitchen, prepared to help, only to find absolute confusion unfolding. My dad stood there with oven mitts on both hands, an apron tied awkwardly around his waist, eyes focused intensely on the enormous chicken. The kitchen counter was scattered with spices, bowls, and spoons. It looked more like an experimental laboratory than a cooking space. Dad glanced at me with the desperate expression of someone seeking encouragement he wasn't going to receive.
"Everything is under control," he said, which is something he only says when things are decidedly not under control. I nodded politely, pretending not to notice the thin trail of smoke drifting from the pan behind him. Meanwhile, my brother Alex was suspiciously quiet, which in our family was the biggest warning sign. He slipped past me in the hallway, holding something behind his back, wearing the face of someone hiding a secretive venture. I called after him, but he simply replied, "It's nothing," and rushed away before I could ask further. I made a mental note to deal with that mystery later, but first, the kitchen demanded my attention. My mother entered the room next, her face calm, but her eyes instantly analyzing the situation like a quiet strategist. She approached my father with gentle loyalty, offering support while subtly adjusting the temperature he had set far too high. Then, Grandma appeared, wrapped in her warm winter coat and knitted hat on her head and boots already on her feet. "I'm going out," she announced plainly, as though stepping out in freezing weather hours before midnight was a normal part of preparation. My father paused, confused by Grandma's sudden declaration. "Going out? Where exactly?" he asked, oven mitts still on his hands. Grandma simply shrugged. "We're missing parsley. A proper New Year's dinner needs parsley. I'll be right back." Before anyone could argue, she stepped outside, the cold air sweeping into the hallway for a moment before the door swung shut behind her. My mother sighed softly. "She'll be fine," she said, though her tone carried a hint of worry only a daughter could recognize. While my father returned to battling the chicken, I followed Alex's trail to see what he was hiding, but he had vanished like a magician mid-trick. Instead, I found small footprints leading to the storage room, where we kept old decorations, tools, and forgotten memories. The door creaked open as I opened it, revealing Alex kneeling beside a dusty cardboard box, his eyes glowing with excitement. Inside the box were a dozen old sparklers, thin metallic sticks we used years ago before Dad decided fireworks were too unpredictable. Alex's smile widened. "Look what I found," he whispered, as though he had discovered treasure. "We can use these tonight." I crossed my arms. "We or you?" I asked. He grinned, refusing to answer, the kind of grin that meant trouble was guaranteed. I made him promise not to use them without telling me first, though I doubted the weight of my authority on an 11-year-old adventurer. Leaving him behind, I returned to the kitchen just in time to see my father triumphantly sliding the chicken into the oven. He dusted his hands dramatically. "There," he said, as though he had just completed a masterpiece. "Perfect timing." My mother peeked inside the oven, politely nodding despite the chicken's burnt edges and uneven spices. As the cooking continued, the house filled with a mixture of warm light, soft music, and the distant hum of cars passing through the snowy streets. For a brief moment, peace truly settled over our home, like a blanket spreading softly across the evening. But peace never lasts long in stories like these, especially not when Grandma is involved. She didn't return for almost an hour. My mother began pacing the living room, glancing at the door every few minutes with growing concern. Finally, the doorknob turned and Grandma stepped inside, carrying a tiny bunch of parsley and a triumphant smile. Her boots were covered in snow, her cheeks cold and rosy, but she looked more energized than when she left. My father stared at the sad little bundle of greens. "That took you an hour?" he asked, gently. Grandma nodded. "Had to walk to 3 different shops. Nobody respects parsley anymore." She hung her coat and sat by the heater, humming softly while warming her hands, looking perfectly content. I couldn't help but smile. Grandma always returned with stories, but tonight she kept her adventure to herself, at least for the moment. The clock drifted closer to 9 p.m. My father checked the chicken repeatedly, muttering calculations under his breath. The house grew warmer, cozier, as the scent of seasoning filled the air, despite its slightly burnt edge. Alex returned to the living room, sitting cross-legged near Grandma, who smiled knowingly as though she could sense the sparklers in his pocket. My mother set the table with gentle precision, her movements peaceful, her patience steady. Then, for the first time all evening, Dad called out with pride. "Dinner is ready," he announced, lifting the chicken onto a large serving plate. We gathered round the table, the soft glow of candles creating warm patterns across everyone's faces. But the moment the chicken was placed down, we all exchanged the same silent thought. Something wasn't right. The outside looked dark and tough, while the inside still seemed suspiciously pink. My father's confident smile flickered for the first time. My mother gently cut a small slice, her expression controlled and neutral, a peacekeeper examining a problem carefully. She tasted a bite and slowly placed her fork down. "Maybe we should order something instead," she suggested kindly. My father sighed, defeated but accepting. "All right," he said. "Everyone get your coats. We'll find something." We stepped out into the crisp 2012 winter night, our breaths forming white clouds in the air as snow continued to drift from the sky. The town was alive with holiday lights, each house decorated with warm colors and the streets filled with families heading towards celebration. But every restaurant we reached was full, their windows covered in signs reading, "No more seating tonight."
Finally, on a quiet corner of the street, we found a small vendor selling hot dogs, steam rising from his cart like a warm beacon in the cold. He seemed tired, older, maybe exhausted from a long day, but he greeted us with a friendly nod, offering the last few hot dogs he had left. By 6 p.m., our living room looked like a tornado had already arrived, wearing a shiny party hat. My little brother Max had decided to try his hand at confetti before the guests arrived, which meant throwing handfuls of it into the ceiling fan. As soon as Dad turned it on, the whole house became a snowball of shiny chaos. Dad stood there, staring at the shiny storm like a man reconsidering every choice that had brought him to this point. "Max," he said quietly, Why did you do that?" Max shrugged. "Science?" Meanwhile, Grandma had decided to help out in the kitchen, which meant she was making things worse. She would lose her glasses, forget she had them on, and then blame the cat for stealing them. At one point, she tried to heat a metal mixing bowl in the microwave. The sparks were amazing. My dad almost had a heart attack. Of course, my mom was the only one who still pretended that the evening was going according to plan. She continued to mumble nervously, rearranging snacks that absolutely didn't need to be rearranged. At 7 p.m., the doorbell rang, and things got a lot more complicated. Because on our porch, there was a group of complete strangers. "Happy New Year," the tallest woman shouted. "We're so excited for the cultural exchange dinner." My dad blinked. "Now what?" The woman looked at her phone. "This is 145 Morningside Street, right?" My dad turned pale. We lived in house 154. They were right. Wrong house, very wrong house. And at that moment, my grandmother walked past us, grabbed the strangers by the shoulders, and announced, "Come in, we wanted to try the emergency pie." We didn't have the emergency pie, but we were ready to be ready. The strangers barely had time to remove their shoes before Mom pulled me aside and whispered, "We cannot host a cultural exchange dinner. We don't even have a culture. What do we do?" Meanwhile, Grandma escorted the bewildered guests into the living room like royalty. The confetti from Max's science experiment was still everywhere, sparkling on their coats, hair, and, tragically, the casserole dish one of them brought. Dad cleared his throat, straightened his sweater vest, and attempted diplomacy. "Everyone, there seems to be a tiny misunderstanding." But before he could finish, Max sprinted in wearing a plastic knight's helmet and holding a spatula like a sword. "The Foreign Alliance has arrived," he shouted. Mom nearly fainted. The tall woman laughed. "Oh, is this part of the tradition? Role play? We love immersive cultural experiences." Dad pinched the bridge of his nose. Hard. I stepped forward quickly because clearly no one else was going to fix this. "Actually," I said with all the confidence of a 14-year-old who had absolutely no plan whatsoever, yes, it's part of our tradition. A New Year's house trial." Mom nodded vigorously. "Yes, the house trial." Grandma added, "And it starts with pie." The guests clapped like we had just announced a Broadway premiere. Dad stared at me like I had personally set the house on fire. The emergency pie situation. In the kitchen, Mom whispered fiercely, "Why did you say house trial? What is a house trial?" I whispered back, "I don't know. It just came out. You figure out the pie, I'll figure out the trial." Grandma, meanwhile, was violently mixing something in a bowl while humming the national anthem, our actual one, not some invented house trial anthem, which would have at least been more useful. "What pie are we even making?" Dad asked. Grandma answered, "The emergency one." "What's in it?" Mom asked. Grandma stopped, looked at the bowl, looked at us. "We'll find out." Dad looked horrified. "Mom, what did you put in there?" "Whatever was closest." That was not reassuring. Back in the living room, the guests were seated politely, admiring the chaotic decorations like we had planned it all. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, asked Max, "So, what is the purpose of the knight costume in your tradition?" Max puffed his chest. to defend the pie." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, symbolic." I whispered to Dad, "Okay, if we just get them fed and out the door, this will be a funny story someday." Dad whispered back, "Or a documentary about disaster management." The house trial begins. Since I made up the tradition, everyone decided I was the one responsible for leading it. Perfect. I stood at the center of the room and clapped my hands dramatically. "Welcome to the New Year's house trial of 2012, I announced, hoping my voice didn't crack. The guests applauded. Max saluted. Dad mouthed, "You started this, you end it." So I continued, improvising at the speed of panic. "The house trial has 3 sacred challenges." Mom's eyes widened. 3? Max pumped his fist. "Yes, trials." The guests leaned forward eagerly. Grandma entered with the emergency pie, which was bubbling, steaming, and emitting an aroma that suggested something inside was fighting for its life. And that was only trial 1. Grandma placed the emergency pie right in the center of the coffee table. Steam rose from it like a warning, but our accidental guests leaned in with fascination. "This," Grandma declared proudly, "is trial 1, the pie of destiny." Dad coughed. Destiny may not survive this. But the guests were already applauding again. I took a deep breath and continued with the tradition I completely invented 5 minutes ago. "In our family's house trial," I explained, "the pie of destiny is supposed to be shared by everyone in the room. Each person takes 1 bite and makes a wish for the upcoming year." Mom whispered nervously, "Are you trying to kill them?" But surprisingly, when Grandma sliced the pie, it actually smelled good. We each took a slice. I braced myself, took a bite, and it wasn't terrible. It was actually really good. Grandma blinked. "I used sugar instead of salt. That explains the sweetness." Dad sighed of relief. Mom nearly cried from joy. The guests took their first bites as well, and their faces lit up in shock. The tall woman exclaimed, "This is delicious." Grandma whispered to me, "Never tell them I used the children's cereal in it." Trial 2, the story circle. Since trial 1 hadn't killed anyone, I confidently launched into trial 2. For the second challenge, I said, each person in the circle must share a story from their year. It's how we bring everyone's experiences into the new year together. Max leaned over to me. "Is that a real tradition?" I whispered, "It is now." One by one, people began sharing stories. The guests spoke about their families, their travels, the strange way they ended up at the wrong address and decided, why not knock anyway? Mom shared the story of trying to bake 12 different cookies in one day. Dad talked about how he hoped next year would be calmer, but also said he secretly loved nights like this. And when it was Grandma's turn, she simply said, "I'm grateful I didn't burn the house down today." We all burst out laughing. Then it was my turn. I looked around the room, at the confetti, the strangers who no longer felt like strangers, my ridiculous family, the glowing Christmas lights flickering gently along the walls, and I said, honestly, I think this is the funniest, weirdest, most unexpectedly wonderful New Year's Eve we've ever had, and I'm glad I get to share it with all of you. Mom squeezed my hand. Dad smiled. Max gave me a thumbs up from inside his night helmet. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Trial 3. The final wish. For the final challenge, I said, we step outside together and make one final wish before midnight. So we all put on coats and stepped onto the snowy front yard. It was quiet, peaceful. Snowflakes drifted down softly, glowing in the porch light. The guests huddled close. Our family formed a circle around them. Grandma lifted her hands. Everyone ready? We all nodded. And as the last seconds of 2012 ticked away, we whispered our wishes into the cold night air. Some people wished for peace, some for health, some for more laughter, some for new beginnings. And though no one said it out loud, I knew we were all wishing the same thing, that moments like this never stop. The distant fireworks erupted just as the clock struck midnight, painting the sky with shimmering bursts of color. "Happy New Year!" everyone shouted together. The strangers hugged us like old friends. Dad invited them to stay for hot chocolate. Mom insisted they take home leftovers. Max offered them a knighthood certificate he made out of construction paper. Eventually, they left, waving, laughing, and promising to visit us again. And when the door finally closed, Dad looked around at our messy, glowing, confetti-covered living room and said, "You know, this was actually perfect." He was right. It wasn't the New Year's Eve we planned, but it was the one we needed. The one that reminded us that family isn't just about the people you live with, it's also about the unexpected moments, the laughter, the chaos, the kindness of strangers, and the magic that appears when everything seems to be going wrong, but somehow turns out exactly right. And that night, standing in the quiet of the house, I smiled to myself and whispered, "Happy New Year 2013."